on day one, I will call Netanyahu and tell him that the genocide is over, the occupation is over, the ethnic cleansing is over, and that there will be a weapons boycott starting now. This room is not the greatest. The lighting is,
No, no, it's
you know,
fine. It's fine. Don't
little
worry.
sub. Does this
Okay,
work for
look.
you? Okay.
Okay, cool. Okay, we're about to get going. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. Today, joining me is Dr. Jill Stein, who's running to be the US president. Dr. Jill Stein, good to have you with us.
Really great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I mean, I know it's very busy at the moment, campaigning and doing multiple back-to-back interviews, but thanks for making time for us. This is going to be a different interview. It's not going to be very much about your policies, but more about you, the person, but also how your journey kind of tells us the states of the USA and the states of US politics. I'm going to start a bit differently. Usually I would start these interviews by asking about how a person would grow up and the home they're from. But the question I'm going to ask you is actually, I'm asking this question because I think it kind of is a microcosm of building a progressive movement, which I think is in a big way what you've dedicated yourself to in terms of politics and being the leader of the Green Party for the last 2 decades. And so going to that, it's actually about AOC. Because I think for many people she has been seen as the new face of progressive politics. Now, recently, she hasn't said very kind things about you and your candidacy. She's called it predatory. What do you make of this entire debacle in terms of what it says about U.S. politics, but also about the electorate trying to have faith in a new progressive form of the Democratic Party?
I think this is really, it's a rude awakening for many who thought that the Democratic Party could be reformed. I myself have been over that for quite some time when the Democrats repealed campaign finance reform, when we succeeded in my home state in Massachusetts of getting money out of politics, but through creating a public financing alternative to corporate money, which can be seen as sort of the mother of all the corruption of our political system that enables policy to be bought out basically by the highest bidder, whether it's AIPAC or the war contractors or Wall Street. Policies are bought and paid for in our current political system, including the Democratic and Republican parties. We passed an alternative to that in my home state, and the Democrats repealed it. We passed it through a referendum by a huge 2-to-1 majority, and the Democratic, supposedly progressive Democratic Party repealed it. So that was back in the year 1998, actually, yes, even before the 2000s. And so it was very clear to me that the Democratic Party in its most progressive state, or arguably one of its most progressive states, was really beyond redemption. And I, at that point, basically got tricked into running for office for the first time. And that's a story unto itself. But that was my wake-up call about the Democratic Party. And unfortunately, that understanding has continued to play out. And the Democrats remain beyond redemption, remain ever more deeply in debt to their deep-pocketed donors. So while the squad has, stood up on some policies, but not very many, they voted for the Iron Dome, they voted, appropriations for that. They couldn't stand up for the $15 minimum wage, refused to bring that to a vote, would not stand up for Medicare for all, wouldn't bring that to a vote. On just issue after issue, they have been vulnerable to their funders and the power of the hierarchy within the Democratic Party, which essentially enforces the agenda of their big donors and puts a lot of internal money and pressure and appointments and all that behind it as well. So to see AOC kind of leading the attack in a way that did not do her much credit, in a way that really made her exposed her as a lapdog for the Democrats, as their attack dog, in fact, seeking to silence their political opposition using very deceptive and misinforming talking points, which I'd be happy to rebut and which we've posted rebuttals to. But there she was trying to silence political opposition. She had run on our Green New Deal, has run on many of the issues that in fact were launched by Greens, from healthcare as a human right through a Medicare for all system, which was launched by Ralph Nader in the 2000 presidential campaign, launched as a national political issue, to bailing out students from debt, offering free public higher education, which were injected into the national dialogue by my campaign in the year 2012 for the first time. All of these progressive issues have been adopted by the progressive Democrats, who basically give them lip service but water them down and, do not effectively advocate for them. And at the end of the day, continue to take their marching orders from Wall Street and the war machine, whether it's denying the right to strike for the railroad workers, failing to stand up on the promise of a $15 an hour minimum wage, to stand up on the promise not to continue the sales of public land in the Inflation Reduction Act. 60 million acres need to be auctioned off offshore every year before any major renewable project can be built. On issue after issue, the Democrats have broken their promises on student debt bailout and so on. They've broken their promises and continued throwing everyday people under the bus. So the squad, I'm afraid to say, has not been effective whatsoever. And AOC has really disgraced herself as a former progressive. The nickname for her now is AOC Pelosi. She's basically the enforcer of the corporate agenda and the effort to silence true people-powered opposition and people-powered politics. It's unfortunate, but for those of us who've been watching this closely for some time, this is no surprise at all.
Okay, you say it's no surprise. I mean, don't you think there was ever a moment, maybe in the last 8 years, as we've seen AOC and the other members of the squad, their sort of political rise? And to a large extent, I think in the last year, and we'll get to that maybe, you've also seen their fracturing based on Gaza. You can see Ilhan Omar, for example, and Rashida Tlaib going in one direction and AOC in another. Many skeptics looking at this will say, yes, but, it's either the Republicans or the Democrats. There's no real viable opposition who could, you could maybe be a spoiler for either party, but there's no real viable opposition simply because of what you've said. There's not enough money for independent parties, all of these things. And so don't you think there's just some sort of silver lining for maybe some voters who are progressive, but kind of still want to see a potential reformation within a viable party? And when I say viable, someone who is likely to win the elections, and want to sort of hang on to potential people like AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib within these parties. And maybe think when they see AOC, they're like, this is not the principled behavior we expect, but it's politicking. She needs to politic further so she can stay within the party, so that at some point in the future, she can actually have influence over the party. What would be your response to that?
That has been the argument all along, and it's not advancing us. In the face of a genocide now, it's asking us to hold our noses and vote for genocide. The Democratic National Committee, which would not give even 2 minutes of airtime to a Palestinian, a true supporter of Kamala Harris and the Democrats, an elected officer, in fact, I think a state representative, refused to give her 2 minutes to talk about the plight of the Palestinians, while they, profess to be concerned, but swear allegiance to Israel, invite Netanyahu, a war criminal, to come and address Congress, give him a standing ovation every 60 seconds, refuse to even consider a weapons embargo, which would end the genocide immediately and bring Israel into compliance with international law and into compliance with the American people and what the American people desperately want in overwhelming numbers, not to mention the world community. So, I think it's entirely inexcusable and reprehensible that we are being goaded into supporting genocide, to affirming it. Every vote that's cast for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump is essentially a vote to empower genocide. Every vote that's cast for our campaign is a shot across the bow of the empire to say that we will not abide by genocide. We are standing up, and we are resisting, and we are growing, and our numbers are growing. And in fact, they are, because of the power of the stranglehold of corporations and billionaires and Wall Street and the war machine on our political system. It's not an easy fight to set this right. We are fighting a very uphill battle, but it's a fight that absolutely must be fought. And it's a fight on which we are making incredible progress. Prior to the Green Party, there was a time when we had more options. And that you have to go back to the early 1900s for that, when the socialist and progressive parties held office at all levels of government, including governors and members of Congress. And, the ballot access laws were changed in order to basically sweep them off the ballot. And there has not been a people-powered opposition ever since. And when parties are founded on true, public interest principles, they are wiped out within 1 or 2 election cycles at most. It's very hard to compete when the Democrats are pulling out all the stops, when both parties have conspired to change the laws, to keep challengers off the ballot, to keep us silenced, to keep us out of the debate and the dialogue. The Democrats proudly announced, in March of this year that they had hired an army of lawyers in order to throw third-party competitors off the ballot, which they have proceeded to do. They publicly advertised for managers of infiltrators and spies in order to report back and essentially to disrupt their competition, a sort of COINTELPRO type program. And they've publicly advertised. We have the screenshots of those ads. They hijacked our public funding, which we qualified for in order to assist with our ballot drives. So they're absolutely pulling out all the stops. And part of that is basically a PSYOP, a psychological operation to convince the public that we are powerless and that resistance is futile. It's not futile. It's only futile if we buy into that. And that entails, I think, taking a good hard look at where we are. As a principled opposition, we are building. We actually have elected over 1,500 local electeds at the level of city council and planning boards and school committees, et cetera. We've had 1 or 2 electeds at the level of the legislature, but the resistance from the Democrats in particular gets all the more intense the higher up we rise. But still, we're the only people-powered opposition that retains ballot access across the country that can truly challenge empire, genocide, and oligarchy. We are the only such option. We are the one such campaign. There are other progressives running on similar principles, but they do not have the reach. They do not have the ballot access across the country, which you have to have if you're going to actually challenge empire. You need to be on the ballot for pretty much everyone, which we are. We're on the ballot for about 95% of voters, and we've been able to maintain that ballot access, and we have defied all the odds and all the history in being able to do that. And we're in a very fluid context right now. Greens have been ahead of the curve on demilitarization, on reparations, on climate change, on opposing, a militarized foreign policy and arguing for foreign policy based on international law and human rights and diplomacy. We've been ahead of the curve on all of that, but the curve is catching up to us, and it's a big wake-up call now for more and more people. So we expect to advance substantially, and I wouldn't rule out a truly, black swan event in this 24 election that is full of curveballs and 180s. I wouldn't rule out a really oddball event where we even could win the White House. But even short of that, we are winning the day, and we are forming a political coalition that's here for the long haul. So every vote that is cast against genocide is a shot across the bow of the empire to say we are not going away. We are here to end genocide and to end the imperial foreign policies, including occupation. In the words of Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Israel is the unsinkable battleship for the U.S. in the Middle East. This is part of an imperial foreign policy that controls, economic markets and resources, in particular the oil of the Middle East. We cannot have, an imperial foreign policy in a world where the U.S. is no longer the dominant economic power. We're in a very shifting global political situation, and we need to change our foreign policy to come into terms with that and to support instead of dismantle international law, human rights, and diplomacy. So I see us as moving forward, and I see this as the propaganda that's intended to make people feel powerless and hopeless so that they will continue to comply with an abusive system that's advancing the interests of the 1%, of Wall Street, the war machine, APAC, et cetera, but which is throwing everyday Americans under the bus. And just one point to that effect, which is we have a military budget that consumes half of our congressional dollars, arguably more than that when you include things like the costs of caring for wounded soldiers in the VA healthcare system and nuclear weapons and all that. It starts to come to much more, and the intelligence agencies that enforce our foreign policy, and conduct regime change operations. It becomes much more than 50%. It's more like 2/3. So it's robbing us blind, and it's endangering us by, embroiling us in conflicts that are actually headed towards potential nuclear confrontation on 3 fronts. The average American household has paid $12,000 this past year for the endless war machine, which is not serving our interests and, puts us all at incredible risk. So it's very important that this conversation be had, that the American public understand what the risks and the costs of this outrageous foreign policy are, what the costs of empire are to us, what the cost of surrendering to basically the parties of war and Wall Street that are not serving our interests. This is absolutely untenable. And it is something that we can fight and can resist, and the resistance is growing. And I encourage people, to go check us out at jillstein2024.com because the resistance is growing. We can demand an America and a world that works for all of us. In fact, no other world is going to work at the end of the day for any of us.
In 2012, I want to speak about your growth because you alluded to it. In 2012, the Green Party got about 470,000 votes. In 2016, you got 1.45 million votes. Realistically, what does victory look like for you in this election? How many votes do you think would be the number where you think now there's a substantial movement growing? That's the one question. And then the other thing is you mentioned these sabotage tactics by the Democrats to get you guys off ballots. Could you give me some more sort of substantial anecdotes just so that
Sure.
the audience and us can kind of relate to what these tactics are exactly?
Let me say, in terms of our goals, our general goal, my general goal as an activist is to do the best you can with the hand that you're dealt. Because, in my view, we don't have a choice. We do not have a choice except to stand up and to fight for true system change, for a system that's actually going to serve us instead of serving big money, which is essentially what our politics is about. The best democracy money can buy is no democracy at all. At the DNC convention, if you looked up and you saw the ring of corporate suites, well, they were going for $500,000 at minimum and $5 million at a maximum. That is the power behind the agenda of the Democratic Party. And the important thing is that we stand up and we fight for a political party that serves people, that's of, by, and for the people, and not for corporate donors, Wall Street, and the war machine. So, to my mind, the principle is really critical. As Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. Building that demand and actually giving it a vehicle which will endure. Bernie Sanders could launch an election, run a great election, have the rug pulled out from under him in a way that was really illegitimate. And then it's gone. It's over and done with. There is nothing to build from. That's why building outside in an independent people-powered party, which is committed to certain principles. We don't take corporate money. We do not take money from corporate PACs. We do not work with super PACs. We do not work with victory funds, which enable a single donor to write a check for $1 million. We don't do any of that. We follow the strict rules of campaign finance, which limit donations to $3,300 in an election. For the primary or for the general. We follow the rules as they were written, not these loopholes for legalized corruption, which is what they are. So it's very important that we continue to build that. And I think standing up and fighting and continuing our progress, whatever it is, a lot of our progress doesn't depend on us. It depends on the dirty tricks that the Democrats are playing. It depends on how many ballots we're going to be thrown off of and the decisions that judges are making and so on. So we cannot control this, but what we can control is our principles and our behavior based on those principles. So, to my mind, as an activist that has chosen not to be in the comfort of a medical office, but really fighting out here in the trenches, addressing the mother of all illnesses, the overarching conditions that have really screwed our health, that have really condemned us to this rising tide of chronic disease, cancers that are working their way into ever younger populations, and just, the desperate conditions that are being fought here. We cannot fix them, whether it's our health, whether it's poverty, which is, a major driver of mortality in and of itself, whether it is pollution, whether it is war and nuclear weapons. These are the big drivers. And I learned, as a medical doctor, that if we're going to fix what ails us, we have to heal our very ailing, corrupt, sick political system. So to my mind, the success here is in fighting an informed and principled battle in the spirit of Frederick Douglass, that power concedes nothing without a demand. We have to be that demand in order to move the system. Now, specifically, if we get to 5%, which would be basically, it would mean like quadrupling our prior vote, something on that order. In the previous election, we tripled the vote from the time before. And I've never seen anything like this race. I mean, this is my third run, and the conditions have never been like this. The American people are really hurting. Genocide is extremely galvanizing. There are major constituencies which are standing up now and understand that all of our lives are in the target hairs around this. We cannot be normalizing the torture and murder of children on an industrial scale. And a lot of people are ready to say, no, this is a red line for me. I'm not going to hold my nose and vote for genocide. So there are institutional forms of support. The African-American community, I must say, is also in a breakaway mode. Many of them are breaking away to vote for Trump because they are so frustrated. Indeed, the entire migrant community is also very much up in the air right now as Democrats continue to, push the envelope and adopt the policies of Republicans and then seek to outmaneuver the Republicans on migrant bashing. So there are major constituencies. 1 out of every 3 voters did not vote for president in 2020, and the non-voters are disproportionately of color, low income, and young. These are exactly the people to whom our agenda speaks, and we can go into that more later. But, healthcare is a human right, addressing the housing crisis, where 50% of Americans now are facing rents that consume 30 to 50% of our monthly income. This is absolutely untenable. People are 1 to 2 paychecks away from eviction. And as a whole, the American public are living paycheck to paycheck. It's about 63%. So there are huge constituents that are ready to be mobilized, and in fact, who are mobilizing right now, and who, in the absence of a principled alternative, either they're not going to vote at all, or they're going to vote for Donald Trump because they're tired of being thrown under the bus. By the way, the most spoiled election ever for Democrats was the midterms of 2020. I'm sorry, 2010. 2010, when the Democrats lost 1,000 seats in state legislatures, they lost 64 seats in Congress and 13 seats in the Senate, and the same number of governorships. There was no third party to blame it on. It was because the Democrats had thrown working people under the bus in the bailouts of 2008, where Wall Street crooks were bailed out to the tune of trillions of dollars, while homeowners were basically thrown out on the street and lost their homes to the tune of millions. And that followed after NAFTA and Bill Clinton. So, working people have been shifting to the right here, not because they love the Republicans, but because they're furious at the Democrats. The Democrats make promises that they don't keep, while the Republicans don't make promises at all. So we have a really desperate voting system in which, the system is very much in flux right now. And the number of voters who are clamoring for another option is off the charts. According to Gallup poll, it's like 63% of Americans who say that the 2 major parties have done such a bad job. They want another major option. So this is what the American people want. The question is whether the word will get out in sufficient time to mobilize voters, to ensure that non-registered eligible voters get registered, and to ensure that people know that there is a choice. And the Democrats are pulling out all the stops, conducting fear campaigns and smear campaigns and voter shaming and third-party shaming in order to silence their opposition, because they are quaking in their boots that people should discover that there really is a principled opposition. Let me speak to your second question about, so how are they throwing us off the ballot? Right now, we are in the process of taking a case to the Supreme Court, we hope. This is Nevada, which was, I think, the first place where the Democrats began to sue us. We had actually gathered 3 times the required number of signatures. 10,000 were required. We gathered 30,000 signatures. which were approved by the Department of Elections in Nevada. We were given a ballot line, and then the Democrats jumped in through the Democratic Party, I believe of Nevada, but it might have been the national. I don't remember which was the sponsor here, probably working in collaboration. And they took us to court first on one issue having to do with the distribution of the signatures. When they found out that they couldn't win on that, then they invoked another issue, which was that the wrong form was used. What was the problem with the form? It was a footnote in the form that that basically had the petition carrier affirming that the signer actually lived in the district that they were signing. Now, that's routinely done as a matter of course when these petitions are being passed. And what the court said in Nevada, the district court, they said that that would be presumed to be the case, and that the burden of proof was on the Democrats to show that that didn't happen, because this is kind of a no-brainer. This is how petition drives are conducted. And so they threw it out. Well, then the Democrats took it to the Supreme Court of Nevada that reversed the decision. A Supreme Court, by the way, which appears to be largely Democratic appointments. And it decided 5-2. And the point made by the dissenting group of justices was that the form that the Greens used was actually the correct one. And then it was the Secretary of State that said, oh, no, you can't use that form. That form is obsolete. Use this form. So it was by following the instructions of the Secretary of State that this form was used, that then the Democrats challenged. And, so this is just so wrong on so many levels that this was the doing of the Democratic Secretary of State. The Greens were right in the form that they used. The difference between the forms is trivial, not substantive, and that there are 30,000 voters who had actually signed in order to have another choice, which is what the American people are clamoring for across the board, across the country. So on all those counts, there should be another choice on the ballot, which would happen to be the only anti-genocide, pro-worker, climate emergency choice on the ballot in Nevada that has a pathway to the White House in being actually on the ballot across the country. So there's one example for you on the incredibly, anti-democratic strategy being deployed here by the Democratic Party in order to throw its principled opposition off the ballot.
In this election, I mean, we've already seen 4 years of Trump from 2016 to 2020, and yes, I think most people looking at this, seeing the U.S. foreign policy, especially with regards to what's happening in Palestine and many other issues, would feel that it's abysmal. It's war criminal. It's all of these. These will be the words that are turned out. Trump, on the other hand, is saying things like he'll deport protesters. He will, he wouldn't allow immigration, like to a much more extreme level. It's almost sounding extremely draconian in his rallies. Just listening to you, it sounds like the primary opposition in your mind is the Democrats. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying just from what you're saying, that's what it seems like. Again, the question is, in a year where there is a genocide occurring by many people's counts, where it seems like both choices are really problematic, but Trump could very, very well be a much more dangerous choice. Do you still see your primary opposition as the Democrats? I mean, it seems like you are in a much more sort of fierce battle with them than the Republicans.
So, this is our way of educating people on the issues where people are deeply confused. So most people really understand that we stand in opposition to Donald Trump and the Republicans, but many people do not understand the principal differences between us and the Democrats. And many people think that the Democrats are the lesser evil. In our view, they are not. We have two greater evils right now, one who is conducting a genocide, one, and the same party, which is full bore expanding our wars right now on three fronts, which has been leading the charge to, dismantle nuclear weapons treaties, and grow the military budget. At least among Republicans, there's some dissension on that front. There's substantial arguments. That's not to say that the Republicans are the solution by any means. They're every bit as dangerous, but they're certainly not less dangerous, put it that way. And in our view, yes, Donald Trump interferes with democracy after the election. The Democrats do it before the election in ways that are not quite as overt, but they're doing it. In the words of Malcolm X, one is a fox and one is a wolf. The wolf has a scowl, the fox has a smile, but he's smiling because you know, you're going to be his lunch. The fox is no more trustworthy than the wolf, and we have two. Basically, in our view, we have two greater evil parties here, and our job is to stand up and fight for the greater good. Dick Cheney just endorsed Kamala Harris and the Democrats. And if you can look at Dick Cheney and George Bush, what was going on there, an absolute all-out assault on our civil liberties, and the massive expansion of wars, the assault on immigrants, the war on the Muslim American community. It was absolutely horrible. And, it was very much in league with Donald Trump. It's not as though Donald Trump is some new kind of fascist. Donald Trump is running on the same, this Project 2025, which has been around for a very long time and was basically a mobilization to shut down the growing progressive movement. And we have to fight back against that, which the Democrats do not do. And they don't do effectively on women's rights. They failed to codify Roe v. Wade, which they had the power to do. They promised that would be the first thing that Obama would do, promised that would be the first thing that Joe Biden would do. They never did any of it. They just trotted out the issue as a great fundraiser, every time elections come around, but they did not seize the moment and actually solve that problem. On so many issues, they are not standing up. Cop cities are being built and advanced under Democratic city councils like Atlanta and elsewhere around the country. And we've got 80 of these cop cities. We have the draft, which has been brought back, which now has automatic registration. And we and our children are being automatically registered for the draft and can be called up if an emergency is declared. Anytime that, the White House wants to declare an emergency, the draft is coming after you. We are in that fascist state right now where people are being fired, they're losing their jobs, students are being evicted from their campuses and from their colleges for simply standing up on what the American people are standing up, which is for an end to this genocide. Simply by calling it genocide, you're labeled an anti-Semite. And, and then your college can lose its funding because anti-genocide dialogue is allowed on your campus. You can be, well, this hasn't been passed quite yet, at least at the national level, but this has been passed by the House, this anti-Semitism awareness bill that basically allows the Department of Education to defund schools that tolerate Students for Justice in Palestine or that tolerate Jewish Voice for Peace and that tolerate an anti-genocide dialogue and want to label that as anti-Semitism. So we are in trouble. We're in deep trouble. And let's remember how we got here. Donald Trump, remember, was lifted up and promoted by the Democratic Party. We know that from the leaks of the Podesta emails that showed this was part of a strategy called the Pied Piper strategy, which was lifting up the most extremist Republican in the hopes that they would be easier to beat in the general. And it did not work that way because the Democrats candidate basically could not run an effective campaign. But the Democrats didn't stop there. They still do that. And in 2020, they actually spent over $50 million supporting the most extremist Republican, enabling them to win their primaries. And while they didn't win the general, you launched the political careers of these extremists. So you have both parties, which are bought and paid for, which are messing with each other. And I have to add, it's the neoliberal agenda of Democrats of austerity, of the dismantling of public resources, privatization, endless war, large tax giveaways to the wealthy. This has been, extremely harmful, has increased the disparities in wealth, made the billionaires super rich, and made working people really struggle. This downward mobility really drives the shift to the right. And so the Democrats are as much a part of driving the rightward surge as the Republicans are, unfortunately. And we don't fix this by just giving the Democrats free rein. We have to stand up and challenge them. One last point here. Under Richard Nixon, a very conservative president, we achieved all kinds of things because we had a powerful movement. We had a powerful peace movement, which was out in the streets, which brought the troops home from Vietnam. We got the EPA, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. We got Roe v. Wade from a very conservative Supreme Court. We were active. Under Republican White Houses, we tend to see a very active populist progressive movement. Under a Democratic White House, which is often serving the same interests, the whole resistance shuts down in order to not help, quote, not help the Republicans. So the way that the two parties are played off against each other is driving us, into the arms of endless war, the war machine, and Wall Street excesses, which is absolutely devastating, which we're not going to survive. We are running out of time, whether you're looking at climate, whether you're looking at growing economic disparities, whether you are looking at endless war and genocide. The genocide in Gaza is not an isolated phenomenon. It just happens to be one that we are out front paying for and arming and equipping. But we've had slow genocides rolling forward with U.S. wars, particularly in the Middle East, where millions of lives have been lost. The Cost of War project at Brown University puts it at about 4 million lives have been lost, innocent civilians lost in the course of these wars, which were downstream of the Cheneys, and their weapons of mass destruction, which did not exist. The Cheneys, who are now supporting the Democrats, who are basically the new neocons. And there's been a merger of the neocons and the neolibs into this agenda for endless war. We don't get out of here alive, and we're running out of time. We have to stand up and fight. In the words of Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. We have to be that demand if we want to have a fighting chance forward. And this is the perfect storm for turning this political system on its head.
Dr. Jill, we're gonna return to all of this now, but let's now go way back to when you were born in 1950. What kind of a home did you grow up in?
I had the benefit of an at-home mother who put a lot of time and energy into her kids' education. She herself was the first generation migrant, or actually, she was the child of first generation Jewish immigrants who had fled pogroms in Russia. So, I grew up in a Jewish family, in a Jewish community, attending a Reform Jewish synagogue, which, I was in the children's choir for the synagogue. I thought I was quite enchanted by the rituals and, candle lighting and music and all that. So I grew up in a home where the Holocaust was a very big deal. And I was growing up right after the Holocaust, and coming to terms with that really mattered in my community and in my family. And I personally made peace with the Holocaust on the terms that we would not allow this to happen again, not to anybody. And along those lines, we held accountable, not just people who perpetrated, not just the Nazis, but we also held the bystanders accountable for allowing genocide to happen. And that was really like just imbued in my DNA. That's part of like how I saw the world, that when you see something terrible going on, you stand up and you fight back. And you do that because all of us have to do that in order to, just preserve our humanity. We have to do that. So that's kind of the environment I grew up in. I went to a public school, a really great public school in this community outside of Chicago. And yeah, I mean, I had the benefits, again, of a great school system, a second generation immigrant family that happened to be Jewish, happened to have skin that's my color. And, the world was ours for earning. There weren't huge barriers that we had to overcome. So, I really regard myself as the recipient of the best of, what society had to offer to its kids. And I went on to an Ivy League school and got a great education there. And, I was very determined to kind of fulfill my responsibility to make the world a better place and ensure that terrible things not be allowed to happen, whether it's genocide or something less than genocide. That was my role to do my part. There are a lot of Jews of my generation that grew up with that mindset and a real sense of social responsibility, and not just Jews, but Muslims and African Americans, who and indigenous people, First Nations who have grown up, having seen up close and personal what genocide and colonialism and white supremacy mean, and have really dedicated our lives to fighting that.
When you think about it, what can you recall was your sort of your first political act or your first active activism that you can recall growing up, or even if it's just a moment or an event that sort of sparked your activistic and political enthusiasm?
Let me say, like, way, way back when I was sitting on my mother's lap, I remember, being told that we can't allow terrible things to happen. We have to stand up. This is our responsibility. So that's like my deepest way back memory. And I was born on Mother's Day, so I had this really close relationship with my mother. And hearing that from her was like a very big deal for me. And, that wasn't exactly a political act, but it really laid the groundwork. The first politics that I actually participated in, so, I was growing up during the women's movement and the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And, so I participated in the tutoring programs when I was in, I think it was junior high school. I was being bussed into some of the projects in Chicago to tutor kids. And, can you say that's political act? Well, maybe, or an act of social activism. But the first like overtly political thing was protesting against the war in Vietnam. And this was in, I think it was 1967 when I was still in high school. And a group of us stood on the corner of our public library downtown. And, I don't remember if we held signs or gave flyers or whether we were just chanting or what, but we were arguing to bring the troops home and end the draft and the war in Vietnam. So that was kind of my wake up call. It was the war against Vietnam together with the civil rights movement at that time. That was really the framework in which I kind of developed my political consciousness. And I came to see that both the Democratic and Republican parties were at fault here, particularly on the war. And it made me quite disinterested in ever being a part of those political parties.
When you look at your resistance then to the war, was it sort of internal? Why are our American soldiers sort of going, or was it about global power and the fact that the US should not be acting as an imperial power? Or was there a process that occurred after that where you started sort of opening up your mind and start realizing the sort of pitfalls of trying to manage the world as an empire and the way the US was going about it? Like, sort of just walk me through that journey and sort of your political ideas in terms of America's empire status, not its domestic politics from 1967 onwards.
I did not understand the larger global dynamics at all. And, what was foremost in my mind was that these innocent people were being killed. The kinds of images that were coming back, the footage of, the slaughter of the Vietnamese people that was happening, was so horrifying. And, I think that was my first impulse. And then my second impulse was, yeah, and we've got the draft, and we're at risk for the draft. And the men at that time, were all just living in incredible fear about what their number was going to be and was their number going to be drawn. So the fear of the draft as really the flip side of this very abusive, murderous war. I really saw it as the war in Vietnam, and I didn't see it in bigger terms because I, didn't understand beyond that. This was really my point of awakening, and it really wasn't until, you know, college and beyond that I began to understand that this was an issue of empire. But even the issue of empire, I have to say, I did not really understand. I understood that it was a talking point of the peace movement, but I really didn't understand the whole history of this, the fact of 80 regime change operations since the Second World War, the actual nitty gritty of how the US was overthrowing democratically elected governments all around the world, and that, this really started right after the Second World War. And it wasn't until I began to really understand the history, really studying the history. I was a science geek, and, I was going to, do my part in healthcare. And that's how I was going to serve the world. So that was kind of like what my range of interests was. I wasn't reading history. I wasn't reading about war. This was just sort of stuff picked up on the fly, and my intuitions about, all these innocent lives being lost. So I did not really make this a course of study, I have to say, until I really became a political activist. My activism politically had much more to do with health, being, kind of health oriented, and then understanding how our health and children's health in particular. It was once I had kids that I really became an activist, because I began to see how children's health was so harmed by our policies. And in particular, it was the epidemics of asthma and childhood cancers and then developmental disabilities that really riled me up as a healthcare provider and got me into the world of actual activism and advocating for communities that were fighting to clean up their air, shut down coal plants and polluting incinerators, and so on. I became very involved in these struggles, basically as a healthcare pro bono advocate, consultant, helping to interpret the data about how communities were being harmed so that we could fight for regulatory protection and better legislation. That's where I really became involved, and that was around environmental health, was really where I engaged. And it was from there that I then became involved in other aspects of fighting for health, like for Medicare for all, a so-called single-payer healthcare system that would provide healthcare coverage to everyone at a far lower cost, basically taking the profiteering out of healthcare. One out of every $3 is spent on the red tape and the bureaucracy. So I became involved in that movement. I became involved in one movement after another, saw most of them get beaten back, except when we all joined together for campaign finance reform, and we won that battle. In my home state, we won the fight for campaign finance reform, and then the Democrats overturned it on a voice vote. But that's where I really became engaged around local issues and fighting for things that impacted our health. And then it went from health to the environment, because that was determining our health. And then it went from that to campaign finance reform, because we couldn't fix the the endangerment, the threats to our health, because of the biases within the political system. So let's take the money out. We pulled together a big coalition and fought for that, achieved it. And then the Democratic Party took that away, which to me was the next lesson, which is that you can't actually win on the election, on the issues, unless you're also fighting the political fight. Because your achievements, if you actually win them, they're going to be reversed. That it's going to take a very big change here. We need to fundamentally democratize the system in order for it to start serving us, even on basic things like healthcare, getting money out of politics, cleaning up our air quality, and addressing the crisis of our children's health. Which is not just our children's health, it's all of our health right now, but children's health in particular has really gone down the tubes. So that was kind of like the motivator for me. And it was only when I got pulled into national politics within the Green Party that I began to study these larger issues. I had sort of an intuitive feel for empire, but I didn't really begin to study empire until, I'd say, around 2010. So this was like well into my political activism. I was mostly active at the local and state level, really did not want to get pulled into national politics whatsoever. But, I sort of got pushed there. And once I got sort of recruited to that, I sat down to sort of methodically understand better what was going on with this empire thing. And once I came to understand empire and the realities of how the US, in the words of Martin Luther King, who was saying it way back in the 60s, and I wasn't hearing it, that my country is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. We are, we were then and we are now. And I really began to understand why this was way more than Vietnam. Vietnam was just an instance of it, but this is the rule and not the exception for your U.S. foreign policy. It is devastating. It's devastating around the world, and it reaps long-term devastation. So, for example, one of our first regime change operations was in Iran. What a great mess we made of Iran. We took out the democratically elected government because um, we did not want BP and the oil supply to be used we didn't want it to be nationalized. We did not want the resources of Iran going to the benefit of the Iranian people. So the US and the UK intervened, overthrew him, and installed a murderous dictator, the Shah of Iran, who was there, for generations, really, and until you had the radical overthrow of his regime. But there are long-term knock-on effects here. These aren't simple crises to then untangle. Same thing in Guatemala, which was another one of the very early interventions of the CIA, which overthrew the democratically elected government. I forget the name offhand, but a democratic socialist who was going to redistribute land democratically. They were going to redistribute land so that it wouldn't just be the oligarchs versus the peasants, so that you could actually have a viable economy and not have so many people, the majority of the population, living in abject poverty. So they were, shall we say, redistributing land from it having been, hoarded by oligarchs for centuries. And so he was overthrown, and that then, just brought on decades of civil war. You can't just intervene in countries and think that you're going to install a dictator and things are going to be fine. It doesn't work that way. You can look at Haiti and just generations of intervention in Haiti, including two overthrows of Aristide, the socialist, democratically elected president of Haiti. So we have a very long and bloody history around that. So it was only after I began reading kind of a critical mass and understanding the history of it that I began to understand the role of empire and the fact that, we are not the monopolar power in the world anymore, but our leadership and our two political parties seem to think that we are. So we continue to be the bully in the schoolyard, whereas we need to, become an adult in the room and join the adult community of nations here in a multipolar world, abiding by international law, human rights, and diplomacy.
A big issue, obviously, in this last year has been what's unfolding in Gaza. And that obviously, brings to us our next, what we're going to talk about next, which is Israel, right? As someone who was brought up in a Jewish home, what were your thoughts of Israel as you were growing up? And then again, when did that sort of have a moment of change, if ever?
Israel was everywhere. My grandfather's name was Israel. He was named obviously before the country, but, there's strong identification with Israel. And, we were part of, Trees for Israel. Every member of my family went to Israel. I don't know if that was on the birthright program or what, but I did not go. And the reason I didn't go had more to do with the Vietnam War and just being, what shall we say, just skeptical of stuff that was being spoon-fed to us. So I did not want to just go to this thing that I didn't really understand. I didn't have anything against Israel at the time, but I just didn't want to be railroaded into a certain kind of identification. And the teaching, to me in my community was this was a land without people and people without a land. And wasn't this great? The Jews had come to Israel and brought, turned the desert green. So that's what we were being taught, And I did not really understand the larger issues until I had become politically active within the Green Party. This was an issue in the Green Party, and the Green Party was looking at ethnic cleansing and the apartheid state in Israel for quite some time. One member of the party in particular had grown up on a kibbutz and was very mindful of, the realities of apartheid. And so there had been a very vigorous debate and discussion inside the Green Party. And starting in 2006, the party had officially adopted a pro-BDS anti-apartheid position. So I began to learn about this basically through the Green Party. And in the first race where I was run for president in 2012, this was a part of our platform to basically end the apartheid state and to support BDS in order to achieve that.
When you go back in your mind to just post September, I mean October 7th, and you saw the reactions from world leaders, but also, I mean, specifically Biden, embracing Netanyahu, being very forthright about Israel's right to defend itself. Also projecting the same misinformation and lies about beheading babies, etc. For you, was this just naivety and bad policy, or do you feel there was something more about that kind of behavior, which was overtly giving Netanyahu a green light to sort of unleash, whatever he wanted to?
It was very frightening to me, and I don't know that I instantly thought, oh, this is going to be a genocide, but I was really aware that the hammer that was already coming down on Palestine and Gaza was just going to explode. And it was at that time that I had to decide whether I was going to step in to the spot that had been vacated because Cornel West was going to be our candidate. And I had helped to recruit him and was really glad not to be running for office and had other plans. And he decided to continue his run solo for reasons that are totally understandable, and I would not fault him for it. It's hard to work with a small independent political party when you haven't already been a part of the party. Greens don't have a campaign in the box like Democrats do. It really depends on knowing networks and who can do what and all that. It took me several races before I knew how to run with the party, running at lower levels of office. So I really understood. I understood why Dr. West wanted to run solo, but that meant that our ballot lines were going to go to waste and that there would not be a challenge, an actual challenge to empire in this race. You can have great voices, but if you're not on the ballot, mostly across the country, then you're a token voice. You are not a real challenge to empire. And knowing what was in store, and knowing that either we had to use our ballot lines with a high-powered campaign, or there would be no voice of opposition to genocide, basically, in this election. That is what, persuaded me that I had to respond because I was being arm twisted to step up to the plate and fill that vacancy. It was mainly Ajamu Baraka and myself who were being intensively lobbied to fill that gap. And we duked it out with each other for quite a while. And I wanted him to run and he wanted me to run. And eventually he prevailed. So, one of the reasons I did that was seeing that this was going to be really the only vehicle for fighting against genocide and empire in this election. So it was kind of seeing the writing on the wall that this was going to unleash, the most vicious retribution imaginable from Israel and the Netanyahu government, feeling that, we need to do everything in our power to prevent another genocide from rolling out here. It was just really clear that something terrible was beginning to happen, and we needed to have ballot status to push back and to fight for a debate, because otherwise the issue will not be debated. There will be two genocidal, and with RFK, there will be three pro-genocide, pro-war campaigns that will be consuming the airwaves with the other, shall we say, mostly trivial and irrelevant issues that they would like to stay focused on, not on the real crisis of empire, genocide, and oligarchy here at home, as well as, the consequences abroad. That this framing was not going to happen. You could have great voices like Dr. West, like Claudia de la Cruz. You could have great voices, but if they're not on the ballot to truly challenge empire across the country, they're marginalized. They're just voices in the wilderness. They will not be heard, and there will not be a debate.
Given everything that you learned and you've learned throughout your life, when you look back at just how retributive the response has been from Israel, and you look back at how, to a large extent, the USA, but other world leaders and other world bodies as well, have kind of allowed Netanyahu to go out and do what he's done.
Yeah.
How much has it shocked you? Has it shocked you? And just what has that emotional and mental process been like, just trying to make sense of everything that's been going on?
I have to say, when you see, beheaded babies and children, that are being routinely beheaded and worse, who are actually being just crushed and blown up to smithereens so that their bodies are being, sort of randomly collected into plastic bags and returned to their families. When you see the mourning going on of families, when you see families who are being, told you have to leave your homes, your home is about to be bombed, go run over there. And then they're bombed over there. And, from the moment that Israel announced that there would be a massive boycott of food and water and energy and electricity and medical supplies, I mean, to me, that was just shocking, just absolutely jaw-dropping. I have to say, in my own mind, I ask myself, is this worse than the Nazi death camps? I'm not sure it is, when people are forced to live in their own sewage, and I don't want to stake that out. I'm not really well informed enough actually about the actual conditions in the death camps, but that's what that brings to my mind. This is like a gigantic death camp here where people don't even have um access to sewage, and where I've heard from people in Gaza that they don't eat and they don't drink because there's nowhere for sanitation. There's nowhere to use a toilet. They're basically living in their own waste products. I mean, this is absolutely inconceivable for healthcare providers to be targeted, for children to be shot in the head by assassins. Um, for healthcare workers to be dragged off to torture camps and tortured and killed because they're healthcare providers, for the press to be targeted and assassinated in huge numbers because Israel does not want the light of day shining on what they're doing. To me, this is just, it's horrifying beyond belief. And I'm numb, and it makes me angry. It makes me angry, and it makes me want to call out these murderous thugs and the absolutely unbelievable, worse in our time, the worst in our time, put it that way, genocide that we see unrolling on our computer screens. It's just mind-boggling what's going on here. And it's being couched under this, anti-Semitism has been weaponized. Resistance to genocide has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. This is resisting Zionism. Zionism is not Judaism. To oppose Zionism and apartheid domination and ethnic cleansing is not anti-Semitic. To my mind, that is the most anti-Semitic thing you can say, that it is anti-Semitic to oppose genocide. When you're saying that, to my mind, that is the most anti-Semitic statement of all. And it makes me just unbelievably angry and makes me determined to fight back, because in the absence of a fight back, I mean, this is just, it's too much to stomach. It's too much to sit and tolerate. For me, the answer here has to be joining together, in a powerful and unstoppable coalition that's connecting the dots between the devastation in Gaza and the devastation of our own communities here at home that do not have healthcare and housing and, can't get out of debt. It's a different kind of devastation, but these dots are very directly connected. And so it makes me focus very much. It makes me double down on the fight to bring this to a halt and to really sound the alarm for people. And not only the alarm, but really the opportunity. We have an opportunity to shut this down in the blink of an eye. That can be done. It's been done before by Reagan, by Eisenhower, with a simple phone call. And every vote is an assertion of power. And the more votes we have, the more power that we have. We don't even have to get to the election. The more we build in the polls, the greater the pressure to stop the genocide right now, which could be stopped in the blink of an eye. So it just makes me more determined. The more horrific this is, the more beyond the pale this murderous genocide is, the more it makes me double down to want to organize to stop it.
You mentioned that this could be stopped with a call. You cited the examples of Reagan and Eisenhower. Do you think if Biden wasn't in the White House, do you think another Democrat, maybe Kamala Harris or Barack Obama, was in the White House, do you think that call would have happened by now?
No, I think there's absolutely no sign that it would have happened. Kamala Harris is taking the same money. In fact, she's been collecting money from more billionaires than any ever on record before. You don't get more moral and principled governments as the money of oligarchs piles up. Oligarchs are richer than ever, disparities are more extreme than ever, and the direct um, uh, corruption, it's legalized corruption for the most part, but it is corruption that's just pouring into the Democratic and Republican parties. That grows, and I don't see another way out. There's actually not a hint of another way out. We do not see people in who take principled positions that are that allowed to rise to power within the Democratic Party, and certainly not in the Republican. Although there's dissent in the Republican Party, they at least have a fight about it. But both parties are committed to this genocide.
You mentioned earlier in an interview that you probably should. I mean, a kind of victory for you would be if you could quadruple your counts. That would take you to about 6 million people voting for you. So obviously, to get to that number, the Muslim vote's extremely important within the U.S. Just a question, in a way, to sort of, I think it's important to clarify for potential Muslims in the USA who are looking to vote for you. Can you clarify for me and for us just what your thoughts are on Bashar Al Assad? I think you may have said a few things about a decade ago where they were anti-interventionist, but it may have just confused viewers. Can you clarify that for us?
We have been attempting to clarify this. We have never taken a position in support of Bashar al Assad. We are against intervention because intervention has all sorts of unintended consequences, which are very long lasting and tend to make things worse, not better, tend to intensify civil wars. We should not intervene. But on the other hand, we have never stood up in support of Bashar al Assad, who is by any measure a dictator with a long record of human rights abuses. And we very strongly support the sovereignty, the autonomy, and the human rights of the Syrian people and their right to determine their future. So we very much support, the Syrian people in determining their future. We are not and have never taken a position on the side of Bashar al-Assad. There was one sentence that was very confusing that had not been approved by our campaign, which was posted on our website. And when that was called to our attention, we took it down and clarified our position in support, basically, of against intervention, but in support of the Syrian people. And we have held that position for a long time.
So if you were in the White House in 2013, 2014, how would you have dealt with Syria and Bashar al-Assad?
So if I were in the White House, I would be studying intensively Syria, because I was not in the White House. This was not, our key and leading issue. So we did take a stand to argue against Russia's intervention in Syria, and, did specifically speak to the need for a peace offensive in Syria, which we were arguing for shortly after Russia began its bombing campaign. We wanted to see a peace offensive and an end to, all of the violent interventions from other countries. So, that's the one position that we did take, but we did not look specifically at Syria. And I would have to have looked, in much greater detail than we had the resources to do at that time. So, yeah, we have not taken a specific, position beyond non-intervention and supporting a peace offensive for the region, a nuclear weapons ban for the region. We've only, supported the most generic kinds of interventions, but generally in support of human rights and diplomacy, as opposed to, bombing people.
Jill Stein, last question. What does a Jill Stein presidency look like? If a black swan event occurred and somehow you were in the White House, what would the world and the USA expect for the next 4 years?
On day one, in fact, before day one, long before day one, on November 6th, I would say, we pick up the phone and I will call Netanyahu and tell him that the genocide is over, the occupation is over, the ethnic cleansing is over, and that there will be a weapons boycott starting now until such time as the rulings of the International Court of Justice are complied with. So, for one thing, the genocide stops immediately. Also on day one, we actually begin an antitrust lawsuit against the corporate consolidated media, and we can do this because the president can instruct the Department of Justice to take the corporatized media to court in an antitrust lawsuit, so that we begin to break up the consolidated corporate media, which is in the business of, lapdog to power. We need watchdogs to power. That's what a free press is for. We need more Middle East eyes out there. We need eyes out, from all areas who are investigating and holding power to account. This is why Julian Assange was, locked up for 12, 13 years, because we did not want U.S. and other power holders to be held to account. So we initiate that lawsuit. We also declare a climate emergency. Because there is a climate emergency. And by declaring a climate emergency, we unleash over $500 billion in funding to begin creating the Green New Deal, so that it's not a choice between jobs and the environment. It's both together, and it's healthier and far more dignified and respectful jobs, because we're not subjecting workers to horrible working conditions that are giving them cancer and, putting them at risk for all kinds of things, including explosions and other aspects of, working in the fossil fuel industry. So we begin to create millions of jobs in clean renewable energy, in public renewably powered transportation, in clean and renewably built housing to address our housing crisis, which we also have. And we also begin to reform our agriculture system so that it's a sustainable system of agriculture, which makes us healthy instead of making us sick, which is what the current corporatized agriculture system does. So we then have funding, which is at the control of the president. We don't yet have to convince Congress to be on our side. There is one really critical issue that we'll also begin work on day one, and that is to provide health care for everyone as a human right. As I mentioned earlier, that system, a Medicare for all system, has a very small overhead. It's about a 3% overhead, as opposed to the 30% overhead under our current privatized system of health. So we're saving basically one out of every $3 is saved by moving to Medicare for all. At the same time that we're covering everyone comprehensively, we're actually going to save $500 billion. I will also begin fighting to cut the military budget so that it's an effective military budget instead of this overblown military budget, which is policing the world and getting us into trouble all over the place. By cutting the military budget, we also have another $500 billion to put into critical needs here at home. And one more thing I'll mention, which can also be done at the president's discretion, which is to bring back town hall meetings. By virtue of the bully pulpit, constituents used to meet with their representatives. Now their representatives are too busy meeting with their big donors. So they're getting their marching orders from their donors. They need to get their marching orders from their voters. So we're going to bring back town hall meetings and shame people who are not stepping up to the plate on that. And we're also going to bring back congressional hearings, meaningful congressional hearings, because now they're mostly, political theater, kind of kabuki theater. So, we need to have an educated constituency. We need to know what our options are, what they cost us, what it costs us not to have those options right now. And that's when you begin to really build public support, and when you begin to build real support in our halls of Congress as well. So we think we can re-engage the wheels of democracy. People are hungry for this. 1 out of every 3 voters didn't vote in 2020. Of every eligible voters, 1 of 3 did not vote in 2020. That's our base right there. We're working to get the word out also to the Muslim American and the Arab American communities and the African American communities who are organized, especially the Arab American and Muslim American communities are incredibly well organized. And word spreads quickly. People are looking for a better way forward, and that is within our reach. That's what our government begins to look like even before we have elected a majority in Congress. There is a game plan here that can be jump-started by virtue of the power of the presidency. We can begin to establish an America that works for all of us, and a world that works for all of us. This is within our reach if we stand up and make it so. And I encourage people to go to jillstein2024.com and join the team, find out more about us. But there's a huge perfect storm right now that gets more perfect by the moment as people discover that Kamala Harris is actually not different from Joe Biden and is being protected in the same way that Joe Biden had, the wagons were circled around him to protect him from exposure. Why is the party protecting their candidate, from exposure, from having a press conference, from, having more than one single interview? This really speaks volumes about, a candidate that is just absolutely not ready to serve as a public servant. So we think that people are really ready for deep change here. Its time has come. And I encourage people to not get talked into holding your nose and voting for genocide. This is the time of change if we stand up and demand it.
Dr. Jill Stein, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Great talking with you.